Hi everyone. Next up we'll be looking at valuing natural capital with Alan Law, who is Chief Strategy and Reform Officer at Natural England.
It's the usual way with these things. I've got a set of slides and I have to sort of work out where and how best to pitch it. I think I can see one familiar face in the group, so so I think what I'll do is I'll provide a little bit of a sense around my organisation and what my organisation is doing in the way of trying to plan for how we engage with the transport sector. And I'll skip through a little bit around that and natural capital, what it means to us and approaches of using it, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of discussion around some questions. So, Natural England, we're statutory conservation advisors. About 2,000 strong organisation. We advise government on policy in relation to all matters that affect the environment, and we engage locally around planning and development and working with landowners, etc., on managing their land. If I was to very simply characterise the state of the environment and the trends on the environment, you would say that environmental features on the whole are declining somewhat, and the main challenges, the main pressures they face at the moment, probably a combination of intensification and fragmentation. So the two issues that we need to address across the piece. Government launched about 12 months ago its plan or vision for the environment, 25-year environmental strategy. And I guess the crux of that was signalling a move away from a siloed approach of the environment being catered for through public funds delivered down through public bodies into something that aspired to be much more integrated between public and private sectors across all parts of government, brought together in the form of local plans, local placemaking. And the concept of natural capital was central within that plan as a means of trying to evaluate where the environment plays a role that is not only for the intrinsic good of the environment, but also serves the economy and serves local communities and society. So we've got various definitions around natural capital here. The key thing for us is around how the environment can be presented as an integral part of infrastructure rather than something that is separate and dealt with on its own. What the natural capital approach does is it helps identify the value of assets, of features, and also the condition of those features. And in effect, therefore, what it does is it provides a means of identifying where you might best invest money in either enhancing the condition or the value of those features, or where you might invest money in developing opportunities outside existing assets. And I think that balance between where you invest in maintaining the quality or slightly improving the quality of what's already there, and where you look for significant opportunities to develop value outside existing assets is really critical for us. In the environment sector alone, so looking at some of the sites and features that we look after, we're starting to move from a space where we've focused traditionally on protecting and enhancing the value of the assets that are currently there, into recognizing actually there can be very often greater opportunities for using infrastructure monies to deliver environmental improvements away from the traditional areas. Now, that's in the environment sector. If you look sector by sector across other activities in different geographic areas, you might come to different conclusions. So if you look then perhaps at the linear estate associated with highways infrastructure, traditional view might be that actually the margins, the green estate on the sides represent something of a liability. A natural capital approach would try and identify where that soft estate, the green estate, can actually be invested in a way such that it actually becomes a a means of adding value to the grey estate, as demonstrated in this simple slide. Now, the point about maintain and enhance that I described earlier on is that sector by sector, the balance of opportunity will probably vary. There will be parts of the country where probably the greatest value in investing money will be in the highway sector, will be around this existing soft estate, the margins, because there is a significant opportunity for investment to add value to those features where they are not in a particularly good condition. There will be other parts of the country where actually there are far greater opportunities associated with looking across development activities, looking at placemaking for real and identifying where those monies could contribute to enhancement of the environment outside the existing asset feature, outside the existing estate. Now, Highways England, we welcome the ambition that they've set out in terms of moving from the current situation, which is of net aggregate loss, into one of no net loss by 2025, and then this ambition of net gain by 2040. Now, what I would probably want to signal here is as a 15-year window between moving from flat line to moving to some form of enhancement. I would hope that we can find ways in which that 2040 ambition can be brought forward in due course. The key things here are having the environment as part of the infrastructure planning, looking at the opportunities around the existing estate and where there are opportunities to enhance there, and then looking outside at opportunities to deliver net gain through placemaking, through collaboration with other initiatives. Won't be done purely through its own estate. What's Natural England doing around this? Well, we're engaging with some of the subnational transport bodies. Where we have tended to be, again, traditionally, is we've tended to engage at the technical level around evaluating projects that have already been drawn up. Where we want to move to is more of the placemaking strategic planning space, where we can try to strike this balance between protection and enhancement, where we can look for some of the opportunities to enhance the environment outside rather than focusing simply on minimizing or mitigating effects of transport or other infrastructure activities that take place that could affect existing features. One of the things we're doing to try and help with this work and help extend the approach is develop some of the tools that support net gain methodology. So there's a methodology around biodiversity net gain that's established. The Department of Environment already has published this, and it's being used in practice by quite a number of organisations. There's likely to be a consultation on the extension of that approach coming in the next few months. What we're looking at also is trying to broaden that out from biodiversity to other aspects of environmental features. So clearly when you start to get into water and forestry, then you're getting a much broader set of features that could be considered within the metrics and that calculation. It's always tempting to look with green eyes at some of the figures associated with other forms of activities. As an organisation that tends to deal in tens of millions of pounds, when you start looking at the sums involved under RIS and tens of billions of pounds, it is very striking, some of the contrast. And this is where this balance between how we use monies around maintenance and how we use monies around enhancement and finding those opportunities to join up with monies that can be coming through from the house building sector, join up with monies coming through from more traditional public sources in the environment area, particularly the agricultural subsidies monies, how we can find ways of collaborating more in places to enhance the environment rather than doing some of the more small-scale gardening around existing features that we currently perhaps undertake. One example then of a case study where we've been working with Highways England, significant infrastructure scheme Again, if you look at some of the activities that we would identify from within this scheme, the biggest areas of activity have been around protecting existing features. So tunnel scheme to protect Thames estuary and marshes, access road scheme, but there is a significant proportion of the land take, a third of the 20 hectares land take associated with the whole scheme has gone into environmental mitigation. So there's significant opportunities around there, but it will be a small proportion of the overall budget of that scheme, very small. What I would hope to find is that if we were having this conversation in 5 years' time, that some of the examples of schemes that we're looking at were less focused on the protection of existing assets and had much greater ambition around some of the strategic infrastructure provision that could be delivered on the back of cross-sectoral projects, not simply looking at the transport infrastructure, but looking at house building and other activities around it. Key points for me then, environment needs to be viewed as part of the infrastructure rather than something that's delivered on the back of it or as a constraint to it. A natural capital approach isn't a panacea, it isn't a universal answer, but what it does is it helps understand the value of environmental features, but not just in intrinsic value, but in terms of their economic and social, and helps provide a mechanism for judging where and how monies may be best invested to deliver benefits, both economic and environmental. And the key bit for me then, strategic local plans will need to be the vehicle by which we both join up funding streams from across different sectors and we identify where the opportunities lie rather than simply focusing on the areas of the constraints. That's all from me. Thank you.
Chris Salby from Jacobs. Just like your thoughts on the design process, looking at highways is probably the obvious one. And just your thoughts on the current approach of sort of mitigation-focused design as opposed to perhaps opportunistic design in relation to environment.
So if you had a platform of environmental speakers here, you would get a range of views. So the traditional view is you have the mitigation hierarchy. So you follow through, avoid wherever possible, you mitigate wherever it's not possible, and then you only compensate in extremis. Now, I think that entirely rigid approach can lead to significant loss of environmental opportunities. And what we know is that we've got something like 6-7% of the land protected under sites of special scientific interest. These are little islands, and the fragmentation and intensification that I referred to at the start has stripped bare a huge amount of what lies between. Basic ecological principles are those islands, they will lose interest over time. You can garden the life out of them for a period of time, but they will lose interest. They need to be connected. So I think there is the mitigation hierarchy is not something I'm saying should be in any way ignored. I think it is an absolutely sound principle. You don't waste good things unless you really have to. But there has to be a time and a place where you say, you know what, we're spending £50 million on something quite marginal. What could we do with that money that could be of far greater value to the environment and add value across a range of features? The place to do that, I think, is through integrated local plans. But the strategic planning structure can contribute to that. And the natural capital methodology will help identify the case, support or otherwise for that. But it has to start with the mindset of looking for those opportunities.
Yes, Mark Sullivan, CPRE West Midlands. There are two aspects which sort of seem to emerge from the approach that might be taken, or at least the way you might be persuaded to go along with Highways England, which is essentially acquiring quite a lot more land. Mm-hmm. And there are 2 points here, which I'm sure you've discussed in actually. Firstly, if you provide an awful lot more planting and change of habitat around schemes, that actually changes the landscape itself away from what there might be. Clearly, if anybody raised roots on the South Downs, to plant all around a new road is actually changing the landscape. That would be a good example, but then things, other areas I'm sure you can think about, so actually creating new habitat or other things might actually have a landscape consequence.
Yeah.
So, and the second point is that agricultural land, I mean, historically, it's been argued that roads should take as little as possible because in the past they were quite contained, and then that's still the case. Agricultural land is in an odd situation, Alan, in the NPPF at the moment. It's not actually, although theoretically it's an economic asset, doesn't actually appear in the planning framework as an economic asset. It's actually the only status of agricultural land, the best and most versatile, is hidden away in the environmental side. And curiously, Natural England is supposed to be referred to if there's serious loss of best and most versatile land, which is not DEFRA. So the question I have there is, wouldn't you, one of the consequences of this might actually be loss of agricultural land, but agricultural land, good agricultural land, is an economic asset, and yet it can be treated as almost as an environmental asset. And you can imagine the cycle will come round, and DEFRA will wake up, or some minister will say, hey, we shouldn't be giving away agricultural land for environmental mitigation. So I just really, I suppose the number question is that the natural capital test needs to think about the agricultural land.
And so thank you for that. And I think that the key to answering that is that, right at the start of your question, I think you referred to acquiring land for these purposes. Now, I don't think it's explicit that it has to be acquiring land for these purposes. So we are set on leaving Europe to see very significant change in land use, one would imagine, on the back of changes to the regime of payments that we've had for the last 60-odd years from Europe. Now that change is going to drive an awful lot of other factors. Now, what you would imagine is that opens the possibilities for different forms of funding to pay for land management practices that serve in the environment. Now, it does not have to involve land being taken out of production, farming. Most environmental land requires active management. It doesn't operate on its own, but it requires management of a certain sort, usually low intensity. So I don't think there's an assumption here that what I've described involves the loss of any more agricultural land. What I am describing is a different form of payment for a different form of management on some agricultural land. And that might, in areas where the change in regime from Europe leads to economic difficulties for farmers, that could be quite an attractive proposition. That won't apply everywhere, but there will be places where it could be quite an attractive proposition. And it need not involve transfer of land ownership.
Do we have any further questions? If not, can I ask you to thank Alan for a fascinating session?
Thank you.